How do we exercise power beyond voting or protesting? I know many of us feel powerless, but what if we all have hidden political power and we just need to access it? Welcome to Future Hindsight, where we take big ideas in civic life and democracy and turn them into action items for you and me. Because democracy is not a spectator sport. Tomorrow starts right now. I'm Mila Atmos. American democracy feels broken. Corporations wield more power than citizens. Our votes seem meaningless against moneyed interests, and many of us have retreated into political silence, afraid to even talk about what matters at the dinner table. We're constantly told there are two paths to change: focus on individual choices like recycling and reducing our carbon footprint, or fight for systemic transformation through policy and political action. But this very framework might be what's keeping us powerless. Today's guest argues there's a third way forward, one that connects our personal choices to collective power. The roles we already inhabit as workers, neighbors, teachers, and citizens offer a template for democratic renewal. Joining us to explore just how we ourselves can be agents for change is Michael Brownstein, co-author of Somebody Should Do Something: How Anyone Can Help Create Social Change. He's professor and chair of philosophy at John Jay College and professor of philosophy at the Graduate Center, CUNY. And before we start, thanks to Shopify for supporting Future Hindsight. Shopify is a platform designed for anyone to sell anywhere, giving entrepreneurs like myself the resources once reserved for big business. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/hopeful. And if you want to support Future Hindsight, subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's easy and free and a great way to build your civic action toolkit every week. Head to youtube.com/Future Hindsight to subscribe after the episode. Welcome, Michael. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
So I just kind of laid out the problem. But really, what is the problem? What's a common perception of our powerlessness, which prevents us from locking arms and working together? And you define it as the either-or problem, but tell us more.
So in the United States, we have imbibed what some social scientists call a culture or an ethos of individualism. We live in what some people think is the most individualistic culture of all time. It comes through culture, the sort of John Wayne ethos. It comes from our economy, the kind of capitalist world that you mentioned in the intro. And it even has sort of infected the ways we think about making change and doing good in the world. So we tell the story in the book, me and my co-authors, Alex Madva and Dan Kelly, of how social change has been developed and thought about in individualistic terms all throughout the 20th century, going all the way back to the early days of like the automobile industry, where there was a problem with traffic fatalities because at the time streets were thought of as places where kids play and life happens, and all of a sudden cars were hitting people. And people wanted to pass laws to make that less likely, and automobile companies saw that as a threat, and they defeated legislation that aimed to regulate them, to make cars not be able to go too fast. And instead what they did is they created a PR campaign to make people feel like pedestrian safety was their personal responsibility, right? We don't have to have any restrictive laws. You just have to be a responsible individual. They invented a term, the jaywalker, which is with us today, which was like a combination of the term of a jay, like a country bumpkin, and someone walking in the city. So you can trace that lineage in our ideas about how to make change in the world by taking personal responsibility, all the way into the early days of the environmental movement. The idea of recycling is very personal focused. It infects the most famous statement in the environmental past, which is probably Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth. There's a scroll at the end of that movie that says, "What can I do?" And the first three items are change your light bulbs and inflate your car tires. The advantage of that individualistic way of thinking of change is that it gives you something to do, right? But as more and more people have recognized, I think particularly in the last 10, 20 years, we live in a world where there are these incredibly complex incredibly global, incredibly systemic problems. Right? Climate change involves how we get around, how we build our homes, how we heat the homes, how we cool them, what we eat, what we do with the food that we throw out, and on and on and on, right? It's an everything problem. And me just inflating my car tires or turning off the lights is not really going to change the problem. And you see that form of an argument develop across all kinds of social change endeavors. So if you're concerned about racial inequity and you've learned that it's important to check the stereotypes that are in your mind and treat other individuals fairly, like that's a great thing to do. And then you learn about the history of how racial inequity is built into the economy and the housing market and all the things people mean by systemic racism. You think, well, that's not enough, right? Me just treating the person in front of me fairly isn't going to fix the housing market. It isn't going to undo geographic segregation or occupational segregation. And so you start to think, okay, well, I need to create systemic change.
Right. So let's talk about that because that's like the jump, right? That's the solve. We need to create systemic change. But also, a lot of people are like, well, how am I myself going to change the system? And, you advocate for a both-and approach. And actually, we've had Beth Sawin on, who is a multi-solver and talked about systems change. And I thought the argument that you make is really interesting about personal choices being structure-facing. Tell us more about how that works together.
Good. Yeah. So we're not the first by any means to focus on a both-and approach. So the problem is individual change is doable but feels ineffectual. Systemic change feels like what we need to do, but how do I do any of that? It feels far away from me. It feels like somebody else's problem. So the idea of both-and thinking is to think about how we can, as individuals, reconceive our choices and our beliefs and our actions in ways that are more in touch with creating systemic change. And so we give a lot of different tools for thinking about that aimed at whatever problem one is concerned with. So if your thing is the housing crisis or if it's climate change or whatever you're most concerned with, we think there are ways to see your personal choices as connected to those systemic problems. So just to start off with one example, because we were talking about recycling in the beginning, right? This is one of the classic ones where people say, you're just wasting your time if you think you're doing anything about climate change by worrying about recycling. A lot of the plastic you supposedly recycle ends up in the landfills or being burned anyway.
Right. I mean, what we need is to ban plastics, but
that's right.
People are not agitating towards that.
Or we need what are called producer responsibility laws, where the companies that make plastics are responsible for recycling them. There are lots of systemic fixes, and I'm not in a position to tell you which is the right systemic fix. I'm not a policy wonk. But what we write about in the book is, instead of thinking about, okay, is it really worth going out of the way to find the recycling bin when I have a plastic bottle? Am I really going to change anything? I can think about my choice in social terms rather than these straightforward material terms. I can think about, what does it tell my friends, my family, the people happening to walk by me on the street, if I make a choice to go out of my way to do this thing that I think is right? That's a social signal. And there's lots of reasons to think, coming out of both the social sciences, long narratives in feminist literature, and ethical traditions from around the world, that we have lots more power to affect the people around us than we think, because we're way more interdependent in the way we see the world and the choices we make in it than we often realize. So the switch of frame there is from thinking in straightforward material terms, like how many bottles can I save out of the landfill, and thinking instead in social terms. How much influence can I have? Who can I influence, and in what ways?
Yeah, I'm curious about the social power of us, being interconnected and signaling to each other how we want to be in society, right? It's very powerful. You write about that at length in the book. But the counterpoint is this corporate power with really deep pockets that is really, I think, changing the way that we think. The PR campaigns are so effective that even though I know my personal recycling is really ineffective, basically, I still do it. I still feel like, it's my responsibility to do that. So how do you think about breaking that mindset and prompting people to be like, right, I need to do this personal recycling because that makes me feel good, and I'm signaling to everybody in my community that I care about the environment. But I also need to do something about the collective efforts to reduce the production of plastic or ban plastic, whatever it is that would be a systems change.
Right. Those kinds of systems changes, I think the fundamental point of the book is to make the case that those are not some separate kind of change that happens by magic, that comes down from a social change fairy. Those changes, whatever the right ones are, happen because individual people like you and I decide to organize, decide to work with their neighbors or their coworkers, not just to mind their own personal choices and decide I'm going to recycle because I'm a good person or whatever, but I'm going to change the culture at my company where I work, or I'm going to lobby my local legislator to push forward a bill that holds the company in my town responsible for recycling the plastics that they produce, or whatever it is. So the change is not from the personal to the collective. It's rather orienting our personal choices toward the collective, toward making the changes in the systems that organize our world that then can have the real effects we're looking for.
Right. So there's so many great examples in your book.
Thanks.
Which one is your favorite example that you love to talk about, let's say at a dinner party, something that's really easy to grasp so that people can be like, right, this is what he's talking about?
Can I give you two?
Yes, give me two.
Okay, so
give me the first one first.
Yeah, good. So one sort of is the one that sets up the problem, and then another one that tells a direction for solutions.
Okay.
So some people have heard of what might be the most famous public service announcement ever, which goes by the name the Crying Indian ad.
Yes.
So this is an ad that came out before the first Earth Day in 1970. And nominally, it was a public service announcement about roadside litter and cleaning up the natural environment. And just real quickly, the way it works is there's a man dressed in traditional Native American garb in a traditional-looking canoe paddling down what looks like a pristine river. But soon you see there's trash around, and he pulls the canoe up onto a bank, and there's trash everywhere. It's like the Industrial Revolution is going by in the blink of an eye. And you realize he's next to a highway, and someone rolls down their window and throws a bag of trash out, and it lands at his feet. And he turns to look at the camera, and a tear strolls down his face. And an ominous-sounding narrator says, some people have an abiding respect for the natural world, and some people don't. People start pollution, and people can stop it. It was an incredibly effective ad. By some measures, it really did have an impact on roadside litter, which was a real problem in the post-war period when all of a sudden we were putting things in disposable containers.
Right.
What people don't know about the PSA was that it was created by a group called Keep America Beautiful, which was formed by CEOs of disposable container companies, bottle and can and chewing gum companies and so on. And they were doing the exact same thing that those car companies did 30 or 40 years earlier, which was trying to get ahead of the problem and prevent states like Vermont did in the 50s from passing laws that would outlaw disposable containers or in other ways put it on the company's ledger. There was another fraud, which is that the actor who played the Native American, who went by the name Iron Eyes Cody and sort of lived his life as a Native American, was in fact a Sicilian American, had no ethnic origins as a First Nations person, and had kind of lived his personal life as a fraud. So there was this double fraud, right?
And when I read that, I really had to laugh.
Yeah. So the story really shows both that cultivation of the individualistic ideas of social change that we were talking about earlier at the behest of corporate power. And it also shows you how powerful that message can be because, again, the message is empowering, right? It tells you if you're worried about this thing, you can change it, right? It's easy. You just have to choose to do it.
Yeah.
I think the same is actually true. We can choose to make change. But again, by reorienting our focus from just taking care of our own little corner of the world to the collective, to the system.
So this is the second example
This is the second example,
All
yeah.
right.
So this is from the end of the book, and it's a story from outside the United States. You may have heard of the musician Fela Kuti, sort of founder of Afrobeat, himself a really fascinating and important person. Before him, his mother, Funmilayo Kuti, was arguably more impactful in terms of being an entrepreneur of social change. She was instrumental in bringing suffrage to women in Nigeria. And her story is fascinating because she started off at a young age with this concern to make the world better. And she also started off thinking, I think, in familiarly individual terms. So she was tutoring neighborhood women in literacy and manners, like how to be cultivated and so on. And slowly over her life, it sort of dawned on her all these systemic forms of injustice that were happening in the colonial era in Nigeria. And she got more and more wise to the structural nature of power in her community. And so she didn't then sort of throw up her hands and say, well, like, somebody needs to change these systems, right? She just reoriented her organizational energy and her desire to make change from the individual to the systemic. And so she organized what had been called these ladies' clubs into community centers that then became voting blocks, that then became sources of organizational power. They had huge protests. And her life really became dedicated to reforming the government in her country, and she was successful in many ways. Her life ended tragically where she was killed by the government, but she was really an inspirational figure and was recognized worldwide for it. So I just like to point to her story as someone who didn't need to be told bad things are happening in the world, you should do something about it. I think lots of us know that already. It was to change her focus from I'm just doing this to make myself feel better, to absolve my guilt, or I'm doing this because I'm going to help this person or that person, to I'm going to change the way my community works, but still I'm going to do it. I have the agency to be involved in making it better.
Right. I was really struck by a section in your book where you write about how people participate in social movements and that they are really sober about potentially never reaching the goal. But what their frame is not that they're going to achieve whatever structural change that they're looking for, but that their personal contribution is a contribution to the movement as opposed to the movement's goal. And so my question here is about if we're thinking about ourselves in this way, that we all have hidden political power in the roles that we already inhabit. So tell us an example of like how that would look like waging battle where we are.
Yeah, so that research you were referencing comes from looking at people who get involved in fights for social justice in really high-risk places, truly repressive countries. And as you were saying, they don't often feel like they are going to change the world all by themselves. They show up because they feel solidarity with the other people there. So they feel like they can make a difference to their neighbor, to their community members. That finding has essentially been replicated all over the world from different academic disciplines in the American Civil Rights Movement, for instance. Another thing you see in that history is people entering into fights for social justice from where they stand, from their roles. So some people see it as an educator, right? That's me personally. I like to think of a lot of my activism in terms of what I teach. And that's not because I'm not teaching philosophy. I'm a philosophy professor, but because I see these deep connections between a lot of the most interesting philosophical ideas and people wanting to make the world a more just place. For other people, it might be as a parent. So we tell the story in the book about a woman named Janice Leitner, whose daughter was tragically killed by a drunk driver, and she went on to found Mothers Against Drunk Driving, which is one of the most successful social justice groups in recent American history. In a relatively short amount of time, it went from nothing to something like 94% of Americans have heard of it. She came to that role as a mother, right, as a parent. I think we have roles at work, right? As colleagues, as bosses, as employees. We have roles as siblings, as spouses. To go back to that point we were talking about earlier about social influence, which is, I think, really key to a lot of this, the best way to predict who's going to quit smoking, for instance, is whether a person's spouse quits. The second best is if their sibling quits. And that lesson translates to all kinds of endeavors, from putting solar panels on your roof. The best way to predict who puts panels on their roofs is if their neighbor does it, to getting involved in voting, right? A really strong way to predict who's going to vote is if their college roommate votes. And I see all those as role-based. So if I'm in college and I want to make the world a better place, there's lots I can do. One thing is I can talk to my dorm mate about what I care about or even why I'm going to vote. If I'm just talking to my partner in bed at night, right, I can talk about my fears for democracy. Like, that's what some of us do already. It's what some of us shy away from. It's early December right now. We're right on the heels of Thanksgiving. There's this whole conversation about whether you talk politics over Thanksgiving. I mean, that's another role we can play as a cousin. And I think we can do it deftly and we can do it meaningfully. And it is a real opportunity to shape the social worlds that we live in.
Right. I will tell you that at the Thanksgiving table, one of my children did talk politics and about systems change. You know,
Nice.
you're talking about people who are poor and don't have food, et cetera, and then the talking point, which was not received very well.
I was going to ask, how did it go?
was that we can have systems change and people don't have to starve in this country, which is accurate.
Mm-hmm.
And so the retort was like, but we would give away the food that is already bad, that has expired. And my son said, no, it would just simply be the food that looks unappetizing, like the deformed tomatoes. Those things get thrown away in the grocery store, but they're perfectly good to eat, you know, and all of these things. But I think when people hear this actually at the dinner table at Thanksgiving or not at Thanksgiving, the first thing is resistance.
Yeah.
They're like, that must be wrong and I must reject it. So if you are in this conversation, how would you tackle that? Because, of course, the other person, so my son was very enthusiastic and animated about this point that people need not starve in this country.
I mean, I think there are some general principles that just come from being a good friend or sibling or whatever, right? About listening and about being open-minded and so on. But I'll say one thing that I think is really eye-opening, or it was for me when I learned it, and it comes from research on confronting racial injustice. So we've all been in the position when we've overheard somebody say something that we thought was racist or sexist. And there's that uncomfortable decision about whether to confront it, to say anything. Mm-hmm. And if you're like me, you're probably terrified that someone is going to be super defensive. They're going to really not like the idea that, you know, if you suggest, hey, that wasn't cool what you said, you're worried about the blowback, right? So there's research that suggests that, yes, in fact, people do not like to be confronted about promulgating a racial stereotype, for instance. However, the eye-opening thing is that they often change their behavior anyway. So they say, when confronted, no, I didn't mean it. I don't, or why are you accusing me of being racist, whatever. Later down the line, having been confronted increases their chances of not saying that kind of thing again, or of going out of their way to treat someone better. So I think that it's a little bit of evidence, at least, that the discomfort can be worth it. And I suspect, although of course I don't know, that following your Thanksgiving dinner when your son brought up this idea of food waste and what we could do about it, the next time there's some headline or some legislator is talking about the rules that govern food safety or food waste or what they think about, public grocery stores in your city, whatever it is, right? That thought might pop back into your mind and say, like, subtly, oh, that is a problem. I wonder what the solution is. Maybe I'll support this person that seems to have a real solution for it. So I guess my point is just that because we're so much more susceptible to social influence than we usually think, because we are these radically interdependent creatures, we can soak up the values that other people show us, even when we don't think we are, even when we don't like it, right? When we're arguing and saying, no, you're ruining Thanksgiving, it still might have this salutary effect on us.
Yes, this is good to remember. We'll be back with Michael in just a moment, so stick around. You'll want to hear this episode's Civic Spark. One small step we can all take to be more empowered and ignite collective change. But first, 2026 is the year you launch your business. You heard it here. It's the year you transform into an entrepreneur, founder, boss. One powerful move puts your future firmly in your hands. And that's starting a business with Shopify. Maybe you've got an idea you can't shake, a craft everyone tells you to sell, a store you have already designed in your head. With Shopify, 2026 is when you finally make it happen. Shopify gives you everything you need to sell online and in person. And that's why millions of entrepreneurs have already made this leap, from household names like Magic Spoon and Death Wish Coffee to first-time business owners just getting started. I mean, after all, Shopify gives you all the tools to easily build your dream store. Choose from hundreds of beautiful templates that you can customize to match your brand. And setup is super fast with Shopify's built-in AI tools that write product descriptions and headlines and even help you edit product photos. Marketing is built in too. You can create email and social campaigns that reach customers wherever they scroll in the blink of an eye. As you grow, Shopify grows with you. Handle more orders, expand to new markets, and do it all from the same dashboard. In 2026, stop waiting and start selling with Shopify. Sign up for your $1 per month trial and start selling today at shopify.com/hopeful. Go to shopify.com/hopeful. That's shopify.com/hopeful. Hear your first cha-ching this new year with Shopify by your side. And now, let's return to my conversation with Michael Brownstein. You mentioned voting earlier, and there are several examples of voting in your book. You talk about voting sort of like it's actually a surprise that as many people as we have do vote. And of course, the turnout in any given election in the United States is relatively low. And you said just now that the number one predictor is whether your roommate votes, whether you become a voter and identify as a voter and go out and vote. And we actually had somebody on who said voting is tautological. Voters vote and non-voters don't vote. And I was like, okay, well, that's really depressing. But all this to say, we clearly are in a democratic crisis in America, right? So when we think about voting, there is one part that you said was really interesting, that you quoted someone who said, if you want to make a difference on climate, you need to vote for the candidate who stands for pro-climate policies. Mm-hmm. So talk a little bit more about sort of the difficulty with voting and how we can wrap our minds around it and continue to use that as a tool, even if it seems futile.
So one question that my co-authors and I have asked people when we've talked about this book in public with audiences is we've asked people to, with a show of hands, how many have ever voted in an election where they have made the tie-breaking vote, right, where the election has been decided by one person. And nobody ever raises their hand, of course, unless they're thinking of, some tiny little thing that they voted in. Then we ask people to raise their hand. How many people have worn that little I voted sticker after voting in an election? And of course, everybody's hands go up. So what's the point of that? Well, if you think of voting as something you do just because you might make the difference, right? You might cast the tie-breaking vote. Reasonably, you might come to the conclusion, why bother? Especially in large elections, like elections for president or for senator or mayor of a big city like New York. The chances that you're going to create the tie-breaking vote are basically nil. This is what's called the paradox of voting in this social scientific literature. And in fact, there's lots of academic literature about, is it irrational to vote? Why would anyone even bother? The reason people wear that I voted sticker is because it's to say, in some ways, to go back to what your previous guest said, that you're a voter, right? You're wearing that identity proudly. You didn't go out of your way to cast a ballot because you thought you're going to personally change the fate of the country. You did it because that's the kind of person you want to be and you want other people to know it. And again, there's reason to think that that spreads. It helps seed a norm in the society. I think that's really crucial because if you're on social media, you might think that the fundamental problem for democracy or in politics today is that we all hate each other and we're all dug into our camps. And to some degree, that is a real problem. But I also think perhaps a bigger problem is still the problem of being passive bystanders, that many people, as you said, just don't get involved, right? They don't vote. And if they're not voting, it's also the case they're not doing other things. As we were talking about before, there's lots of ways to create social change, and lots of people are just sort of throwing up their hands and not getting involved in any of them. One reason, I think, is because people see how difficult and complex all kinds of problems are, whether they think the economy is rigged or whether they think climate change is going to doom us. And they just sort of feel like, I can't do anything about that. I'm going to just mind my own business and forget about the rest. And so the message and a lot of the effort we put into getting people to vote should be focused on this idea of creating an identity around it, thinking of how do you convince people that they want to be a voter, that they want to be that kind of a person, rather than falsely promising that with their one vote, they're going to change the outcome of the election, right? It's the analog of that idea that, like, you should recycle because when you throw that bottle in the bin, it's going to change climate change, right? No,
we need
it's
a new
not.
PSA about being a voter and being somebody who's not a litter bug.
That's right. And so, again, this is the way in which it connects the personal to the collective is when you do it for that reason, you make your values clear and you help support norms around changing the world that we live in and making it a better place. The other thing that you do for any one of these choices is you affect your future self. So one avenue is affecting other people, but affecting your future self and the next decision you make might be equally important. And there's lots of really interesting literature from economics and from psychology suggesting that when people take a first initial step, some small thing, whether it's choosing to ride their bike to work rather than drive or going and voting for the first time, it can lead to bigger, more impactful things later down the line. It can be like a foot in the door for seeing yourself as a potential change maker. And I think pursuing that avenue of thinking about ourselves is equally crucial.
Yeah, I like that. So we are, of course, huge proponents of civic engagement. And you talk about how sustained civic engagement, like showing up to public utility commissions, is essential democratic work, even when it seems boring and like, oh my goodness, I'm going to show up at 6 p.m. at some random school in my neighborhood to talk about the public utility commissions are not in the random school. And in places like Texas, they're very important. But is this where democracy actually happens in your mind?
So I tend to resist the idea that there is any one fundamental thing that, like, this is the only place that democracy matters, or the bedrock of democracy, or the fundamental problem is the corporations or capitalism or education or whatever, right? And this connects what we were talking about earlier about roles, that there are just lots and lots of problems out there and lots of solutions and lots of roles that we can all play in bringing about those solutions. So that is, I think, a way in of thinking about why it's worthwhile to invest time in local forms of democracy, whether it's going to a public utility commission meeting or whether it's going to a school board meeting or in the New York City context, going to your community board meeting. So those can feel like small potatoes, and I think that gets in the way for a lot of us, right? Like, I want to go out and defeat Trump or something. Who cares about taking the time to argue about the curriculum in my local public school or whatever? But it's really important, and again, it can act like a foot in the door for anything else that you might do later. It stokes the fire for change, and I think maybe even more importantly, it creates community, right? I mean, in many ways, that's what we're really trying to do in the end of the day anyway, right, is be in communities that are founded on respect and that are welcoming and are just. And when we create those in our local lives, right, in our neighborhoods, it shows why it's worthwhile and why it's worth fighting for at the state or the national or the international level. Now, I do think the sort of boring thing is a barrier for lots of us because, at least in some cases, like, our heads are clouded with these glorious images of revolution and mass demonstrations, right?
Yes,
and
glorious
it's like not
images.
worth it if we're not going to achieve glory on day one. And so I just think we have to resist that temptation and be willing to do the work over time, to be the person who just shows up day in and day out and makes the coffee and does the photocopies and all that kind of stuff. There's really compelling evidence that implementation is where a lot of good ideas go to die, which is to say, like, people fight to get some law changed. Like in the New York City context, since we've been talking about climate change, the local building laws that have been created to make it so that new buildings have to be efficient, the fight since the passage of those laws is in implementing them effectively. And too often what happens is once the law is inked or the big protest happens, most people kind of wash their hands and go about their business, and then the lobbyists show up and kind of take over. And so being willing to do the day in, day out grind is really essential. For me, the metaphor that I use to think about how to do that and how to keep my own spirits up about it is likening it to therapy. You don't go to a therapist and think they're going to just give you the answer and here's how to be happy or how to solve your problems, right?
Right.
As they say, you have to do the work. And I think in creating social change, it's the same, right? I think they say no mud, no lotus. You have to do the work.
Okay. That's a great analogy. Well, let's talk a little bit about tipping points and sustained engagement, because we talked about the futility or the perception of futility of voting. And there's, of course, despair when you think, my goodness, it's like going to the therapist and it will never change. I'm going to go to the therapist until I die. And
Seen too many Woody Allen movies.
But it's the kind of thing where, for example, we know that 90% of people want definitive, effective action on climate. And it's not forthcoming. And so when we keep on plugging in and we show up to the meetings and do the photocopying, at what point will we reach the place where people switch their mindset? What does the research show that, you've looked at so many things, where scattered individual concern becomes collective democratic power?
So I don't actually think there's one core insight that says here's when it happens, but it's clear that it does. So social change can seem like it's never going to come. Mm-hmm. People slave away for decades at something. And then overnight, it seems like things can happen rapidly. You look at, for instance, the temperance movement in the United States, which led up to prohibition. Temperance activists worked for a century to ultimately amend the Constitution of the United States, something that seems impossible today. And it happened, and then, almost a decade later, it was taken back, right? So
But wait, you said it took them a century. So, note to self, right?
Yes.
If we want to change the Constitution, it's possible it might take a century.
Good. So there's two lessons there. One is that even the most far-reaching, fundamental, deep structural change, like amending the Constitution of the United States, is not a guarantee of success. And that connects back to what we were saying before about implementation, about sticking around after the law is inked and making it stick, making it successful, making sure it actually helps people. I think that didn't happen with prohibition. It was never popular. People hated it. It created organized crime, all kinds of bad effects, even though it had some really valuable effects like domestic violence decline dramatically. And so it was reversed a decade later, right? But the other lesson is that nobody knew they were going to succeed in the temperance movement until they did. And I think we often think that the unpredictability of the future is a demotivating thought. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, how long am I going to have to keep fighting for fill in the blank, fighting to deal with climate change or fighting for racial justice? Nobody can tell you, and that can be terrifying and it can be crushing. But the flip side of it is that if you don't know the future, you don't know the future, and change could be coming right around the corner. And in most cases, when momentous change has happened, when a tipping point has been reached, nobody knew it, right? Mm-hmm. Until it was right there. And that, to me, is a motivating thought, right? A reason to stick around and keep at it, because it could be tomorrow that the fire lights and things really happen. I think that's one of those fundamental lessons about unpredictability, is that if you're in a sort of pessimistic mindset, it can be a demotivator, but it doesn't need to be that way.
Yeah, well said. I have to remember that. But I also always say when people is like, oh, it's not going to turn out that way, I'm like, we don't know that.
Yeah, that's
we
right.
just don't know.
And it cuts both ways. I mean,
yes,
I think
of course.
People often are a little too convinced that the solution that they have in mind for whatever problem is the only one. We recommend in the book what we call an experimental mindset, the idea that we ought to be, as a society, more willing to try structural changes, document the effects, and then adjust as needed. This was, not to make it too local and New York City-ish, but one of the exciting things about Zoran Mamdani's campaign, to me, leaving aside whatever one thinks about his specific policy proposals or democratic socialism or whatever, I think he really embodied this experimentalism where he said, look, we're going to try this, and if it works, great, right? We'll then answer the skeptics. And if it doesn't, we'll stop and we'll try something else. And he sort of opened the window, I think, for considering ideas that people have for a long time resisted just by having this open-mindedness and experimentalism about policy.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So every week on Future Hindsight, I ask my guests to share a civic spark, one small step we can all take to be more empowered and ignite collective change. And we just talked about maximizing our own influence where we stand. So for listeners who are stuck between futile individual actions and overwhelming systemic problems, how can they figure out their own leverage point and then actually plug in and move the needle?
So hopefully this isn't unsatisfying in the sense that I want to not give you one specific answer.
Okay.
Having written a book about how to make change, people have often asked me, so what are the top 10 things to do? Or like make it a listicle,
right?
Make
it a listicle, yes.
And
let's not do that.
I always want to say, I don't have a top 10 list. I think people have all these different opportunities in their lives, again, as parents, as friends, as coworkers, as bosses, employees, as investors, as soccer coaches. All the different things we do give us opportunities to interact with other people. And to me, the fundamental message is, here's a two-parter.
Okay.
One is, doing anything is usually better than doing nothing, so long as one has that experimental mindset about it, which is to say you see what happens, you try, and then you adjust based on the outcomes. One place I take inspiration for saying that doing something is better than doing nothing is from what activists often say, which is that the antidote to despair is action.
Mm-hmm.
Just trying something. But the addendum, the second idea that I would add, is doing anything with other people, doing it in community. That is the missing ingredient, I think, often from doing something once and then going back to your life, right, to absolve yourself of whatever guilt that you have about the world not being a just place, and really sticking around and finding inspiration and it leading to the next thing, is that you find community, you find other people who you like doing things with, you find people that inspire you, that surprise you, that give you new ideas. And so if it's climate change that you're most concerned about, there are lots of organizations that you can join up with. But it's also, again, that you can take a little step like riding a bike one day to work, and then when your coworker says, did you just ride your bike to work? Right? You can say, yeah, I'm trying it out. I thought I'd see how it feels. I'm really worried about the emissions from my car because I was reading about how disastrous it'll be if we get to 2 degrees of warming. And again, the amount of greenhouse gas you saved by riding your bike that day doesn't matter. That's what everyone wants to go to. What matters is that you just had a conversation with somebody about why climate change is really terrifying and what you want to do about it. And then that person might have a conversation with another person and so on. And so doing something rather than nothing and doing it with others is my recommendation.
Yes, good advice. Looking into the future, what makes you hopeful?
People have often described this book as optimistic, and I bristle a little bit when they do that because I feel like I can't tell the future. Optimism sometimes feels a little bit like overconfidence, like you think you can predict the future and know that everything is going to turn out for the best. I don't feel that way. But I do think the book is forward-looking, and whatever the odds are that we're facing for whether it's preserving democracy or a habitable planet or overcoming racial injustice, whatever the long odds are, we're in the position, if we care about those things, of having to do something about it. And being hopeful that we can make a difference is, I think, crucial. So for me, what gives me hope is that I think at the end of the day, with some notable exceptions, most people are trying to do good. I think they might have, in many cases, bad information about what's wrong in the world or how to do anything about it, or they might feel pessimistic and not really be trying because they feel disempowered. But I think most people I encounter want the world to be a more just and fair place. and they either feel like they don't know how to make it that way, or they need tools, they need skills and ideas and things to do to make it better. It gives me hope because I feel like without that, we would really be lost.
Yes, I agree. Thank you so much, Michael, for joining me on Future Hindsight. It was really a pleasure to have you on the show.
Oh, the pleasure was all mine. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Michael Brownstein is co-author of Somebody Should Do Something, How Anyone Can Help Create Social Change. He's also professor and chair of philosophy at John Jay College and professor of philosophy at the Graduate Center CUNY. Remember, civic action doesn't have to be complicated. It's about small steps that spark progress, like sharing this episode with a friend. Let's recap this week's Civic Spark and fire up our collective power. Experiment. Doing anything is better than doing nothing. Like the adage goes, the antidote to despair is action. And while you're at it, grab a couple of friends or meet a few new friends and have those conversations. Take that action and do it all collectively. Thank you all for listening this year and keeping us in your feed. We're so grateful for our listeners. We're so grateful for all the abundance in winning awards this year at the Signal Awards and at the Anthem Awards. And also, I was deeply honored to receive the CACF Built from Bravery Award this year. So this is our last new episode of the year, and I wish you happy holidays and a happy 2026. In our first new episode of 2026, we'll be joined by Amanda Jones. She's an American librarian and anti-censorship advocate and the author of That Librarian, The Fight Against Book Banning in America. That's next time on Future Hindsight. Now, be sure to follow us on your podcast app so you'll never miss an episode. And if you're listening on your browser, you can find Future Hindsight on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other podcast app. We're here to build your civic action toolkit every week. So follow Future Hindsight now and we'll come right to you. And if you want to support Future Hindsight and all the work we do as an independent, pro-democracy podcast, consider subscribing to the Civics Club on Patreon. Head to patreon.com/Future Hindsight now to join. Thanks for tuning in, and until next time, see clearly, act boldly, and spark the change you want to see. This episode was produced by Zack Travis and me.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,